Hey guys, this is Dr. Amira, and I am coming to you from my house. So welcome. First of all, I hope you guys are all healthy and your families are okay. I know this is a very hard time right now. I'm going to try to make your life and my life as easy as possible. If you have any questions throughout this time, please let me know. And I'll try to make these videos kind of fun. I'll introduce you to my dog, maybe some other fun things. But what we're going to do right now is just go through the material on content analysis. So hopefully you can see the slides. I'm going to sort of go through them one at a time. So for those of you that weren't there on Friday before the spring break, we talked a little bit about what a content analysis is. I will go over that plus some new material in this video. So content analysis is a research method aimed at summarizing trends in written, spoken, and visual communication by counting specified features of the content. Whew, that's a lot. So let's think about a classic example of this. Some people in our class are wondering for their final paper about whether the media has a political bias. Okay. So that is an example of looking for trends in written or visual or spoken communication, right? And it's really important that we differentiate this from the other types of research methods we've talked about so far. So in previous classes, when we were talking about observational studies or experimental studies, we were talking about relationships between variables. So does X cause Y or does X affect Y? Content analysis has nothing to do with X affecting Y. There are no variables. When we ask the question, does the media have a bias? What we're asking is there a trend in media content? Right? If we wanted to do an X affects Y question, we'd have to reframe the question as this. Does media bias affect someone's opinion on, presidential election candidates? That's an X affects Y question. But does the media have a bias at all? That's not an X affects Y question. That's just, is there a trend in the content? So there's a big difference in this type of research method versus the other ones. So you can do content analysis qualitatively or quantitatively. And I'm going to teach you guys how to do it quantitatively, which means that we are counting features of the content. We're actually putting a number to it. So in essence, we're actually taking qualitative material, media, or whatever it is that you're analyzing, and we're making it into data. Okay. So when we do content analysis, there's usually three categories of things that we can analyze. There's verbal discourse, there's visual representations, and there's written word. So what does that mean for political science in particular? Because that can really apply to anything. For political science, that usually means things like news media, that can be print, television, radio, podcasts, political speeches, political advertisements. It could also be things like interviews, that's content, photographs. If you want to analyze media bias, you can look at the photographs that they use of major candidates in newspapers. You can analyze political cartoons or political movies. You could also analyze open-ended survey questions. Again, this is all review from what we talked about last class. When we give survey questions to people that are open-ended, it means they can write whatever they want for their answer. And some people write entire paragraphs. That's not data. That's qualitative information that we have to turn into data. So if we ask people in a survey, tell us your thoughts about Congress, suddenly we have all of these thoughts written down. And that's meaningless in a data spreadsheet until we go through it. If our research question is, are people speaking negatively or positively about Congress, we actually have to go through and score it for how negative or positive it sounds. So that's what we mean by using an open-ended survey question for content analysis. So there are lots of steps in this process, and I'm going to walk us through some of them in this video, and then I'm going to do another batch of them in another video, because we're supposed to make these videos kind of digestible and short. So here is the first step to doing content analysis. First of all, you have to have a question and a hypothesis, although I'll briefly mention that sometimes content analysis questions don't have a hypothesis per se. So if you look at the content analysis of media bias, they always have a question. The question might be, does the media have a bias towards Democratic candidates or towards Republican candidates? They don't always have a hypothesis. Sometimes they just say, we're gonna do the analysis to see what's there. But they always have to have a question. So let's pretend that our question is, do general election campaign speeches become more pessimistic over time? Okay, so we want to analyze general election campaign speeches, and we're looking for pessimism levels or optimism levels over time. So you have to have your question. Okay, step 2. You are going to set parameters. There's kind of a lot that goes on in this step, but when we say parameters, we mean sometimes the content that you're interested in analyzing, there's just too much of it. So if someone asks the question, does the media have a bias? I want you to ask yourself, can we really analyze the entire media? I mean, that would take years and years and years. The media is always growing and expanding. So we have to put some limits on this. So when we say parameters, that's what we're talking about, like putting some limits on this if that's necessary. So the first thing is define the population of content that you wish to analyze. The word population is something that's going to come up next week when we talk about sampling. So we haven't really gotten to that yet. Sometimes that happens in 205, but you're going to define the population. In our question, do general election campaign speeches become more pessimistic over time? Our population is all general election campaign speeches. That's what we are interested in. So that's our population. So the next question is, can we analyze the entire population? Can you or I analyze all general election campaign speeches over time? If the answer to that question is yes, then you're going to analyze all of them. Sometimes the answer to that question is not yes. So if you're going to ask, does the media have a bias? There's no way you're analyzing all of the media. So you have to do something that we call sampling. And again, this is sort of next week's lecture. So don't worry about sampling procedures just now, but it does mean that we have to put some sort of limit on this. Or maybe we are going to do general election campaign speeches in a certain time frame. Okay, so I would say that for our question, we probably do have to sample. We can't use every general election campaign speech ever written. It's going to be too much. Next, we are going to choose the units of analysis that we are analyzing. So in our example about campaign speeches becoming pessimistic, what is our unit of analysis? So there could be a number of them here. The entire speech could be the unit of analysis. And what that would mean is when we go through every speech, we give each speech a code for how pessimistic it is. So the entire speech is the unit. We could say that the unit is every paragraph of the speech, which means that Every paragraph gets its own code for how pessimistic or optimistic it sounds. The unit could be the sentence. We could go through every sentence of the speech and give it a code, and so on and so forth. But you're going to choose a unit to analyze. In our example, I think it would make sense to use the entire speech, and the entire speech will get a code for how for how pessimistic or optimistic it is. Set the time frame. So this is part of sampling. Are we going to use every single speech ever done? Probably not. It's a heavy lift. So let's say that we're going to use speeches in the last 20 years. You want to choose a time frame that makes sense. You don't want to choose it arbitrarily. So there should be reasons for every decision that you make. You should be able to explain, I'm using the last 20 years because speeches are more readily available online. You can find them easily, et cetera, et cetera. And then step 3, and this is really the step that requires a decent amount of explanation, is you actually have to go through this stuff and code it now. You have to go through the speeches and provide it with a code or a number for how pessimistic or how optimistic it sounds. How do you do that? Well, you have to create a rigid set of rules for how to measure the feature of interest. And in our example, the feature of interest is pessimism or optimism, some level of pessimistic to optimistic. That's the feature that we're going to do. So now we're going to go through step 3 in more depth, and this can be a little bit complicated sometimes. So if you guys have questions, make sure that you ask me questions over email. So here's step 3, coding and criteria for content. So the first thing, I know that in 205, we're very fond of defining things. You have to define the concept that you're interested in. Sometimes these things are obvious. If you want to know how long a speech is, it's going to be easy to define that, the number of words or the number of paragraphs. But what if we're interested in how pessimistic a speech sounds? You have to provide the definition of what you mean by pessimism or optimism. Or if you're doing media bias, you have to define what that bias is. You have to be very clear about that for the reader. So that is the first step, define pessimistic. And then comes the hard part. How does one identify what pessimistic means? Okay, and there's lots of different ways of going about this. There's no way that's perfect. This is social science after all. So first of all, how are you going to do this? Well, you could look for specific predetermined words that relate to this concept, and you could count them. So you could say, we're going to go through every speech and we're going to look for the following words that indicate pessimism. The words are negative, awful, horrible, failing, etc., etc. You might want to give those words 1 point each, or you could give them different weights. But you're going to go through the speech and identify those words so that ultimately the speech gets a score. Maybe if there are 3 pessimistic words and 3 optimistic words, that sort of neutrals out to 0 and that speech gets a 0. So that's one way of doing it. Or you could simply go through the speeches and provide a code on a scale of 1 to 5 for how pessimistic or optimistic that speech sounds overall. That sounds a bit more subjective, and there might be more sort of rules associated with what does a 1 on this scale indicate? Does a 1 indicate that the speaker is using an overwhelming number of negative words? Does it mean something else? These are things that you are going to have to think through before you provide that 1 to 5 code. So you have to come up with a set of rules that indicates, you know, how you're going to score this. And you have to follow those rules very systematically to make sure that every speech is coded the same way. So what are the best practices for doing this? First of all, you could have a computer do the coding, and there are programs for that. You can have computers go through lots and lots of speeches or lots and lots of media content, and they actually have the ability to figure out how negative a speech sounds or how positive a speech sounds. There are some really advanced programs out there that do this. You guys have probably seen word clouds before. They can pull out what words are most commonly cited in speeches or in news media. There are certain pros and cons with having computer technology do this for us. So the good thing about computer technology is that it doesn't have a human bias. So it's going to score things exactly the same for every speech, right? If we have humans do this, there's going to be some human error involved. So computers don't have that human error. The other thing that you can get from a computer is that it can code an enormous amount of content. You can give the computer hundreds and hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of news articles or speeches, and it can do that in a really efficient time period. Humans can't do that. However, not all of us have access to those computer technologies. So a lot of times we have research assistants do it for us. As you know, as the researcher, I can't code my own content because I have a bias. The bias is towards my hypothesis, or my bias is towards getting a finding at all. We've talked about that before. So you need research assistants to follow your rules that you have laid out and do the coding for you. And as you may have guessed, the research assistants should not know the hypothesis of the study, right? Because if they know the hypothesis, they might develop a bias. Maybe they want you to find results because they like working for you and they want you to do well in your career, or maybe they don't like working for you and they don't want you to find results. So they can't know the hypothesis, and we call this blind coding. So those are the basics of how to do the content analysis for this video. In the next video, I'm going to show you guys the steps that you have to go through in order to train researchers to do the content analysis, because there's a whole training element that comes with that. So that's the end of this video, and I will post a second one as a follow-up. So hope you guys are doing well.